The slap echoed through the restaurant. Every fork froze midair as the Korean Mafia boss slowly touched his reddened cheek, his expression unreadable. One slap. That's all it took to seal her fate with the most dangerous man in Seoul's underground. As his security moved toward her, fists clenched and ready, he raised one hand, stopping his men cold, looked her dead in the eyes, and said the last 7 words anyone expected from Seoul's most ruthless kingpin. "Marry me. Right now, or everyone in this restaurant dies." Welcome to K-Fairy Tales Stories Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Isabella Okafor had never intended to slap anyone that night. She'd arrived at the Silver Phoenix restaurant with one goal, to collect her final paycheck, and disappear before anyone noticed she was leaving Seoul for good. 3 months of serving entitled customers had drained her savings and her spirit. The modeling contract that brought her to Korea had turned out to be a scam, leaving her stranded 7,000 miles from Lagos with nothing but debt and broken dreams. Tonight was supposed to be simple: get the money, pack her bags, catch the morning flight home. But nothing in Isabella's life had been simple since she'd met Kang Min-ho. She'd first seen him 2 weeks ago when he'd walked into the Silver Phoenix like he owned it, which she later learned he actually did. He'd taken the corner table, the one reserved for VIPs, surrounded by men in expensive suits who moved like predators. Isabella had been assigned to serve them, her hands shaking as she approached with the wine list. When she'd gotten close enough to see his face properly, her breath had caught. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous. Sharp jawline, dark eyes that seemed to see through everything, lips that curved into something that wasn't quite a smile when he'd looked up at her. Their eyes had met for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that had somehow rewired something fundamental in Isabella's chest. He'd ordered in Korean, his voice low and commanding, and she'd nodded even though she'd only understood half of it. Her Korean was still clumsy after 3 months, all wrong tones and missing particles. When she'd brought the wrong bottle of wine, stumbling over her apology, he'd waved it away with one elegant hand. "Keep it," he'd said in perfect English, those dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her skin flush hot. The mistake makes it more interesting. She'd felt his gaze on her all night, heavy and constant, like a physical touch she couldn't escape. The next evening he'd returned, and the evening after that, always alone now, always requesting her section, always watching her with those eyes that seemed to catalog her every movement. He never touched her, never said anything inappropriate, but his presence filled the restaurant like smoke. Other customers started avoiding her section. The other waitresses whispered behind her back, their jealousy sharp as knives. Isabella tried to ignore him, to treat him like any other customer, but it was impossible. Something about Kang Min-ho made her pulse race, and her hands tremble, and her body respond in ways she'd never experienced before. By the end of the 2nd week, Isabella had learned things about him from the kitchen gossip. He was the head of the Kang family, one of Seoul's most powerful crime syndicates. He controlled half the city's underground operations, gambling, protection, information brokering, everything that happened in the shadows. Politicians feared him, police avoided him. His enemies disappeared in ways that ensured no one else would challenge him. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and completely untouchable. The kind of man a smart woman stayed far away from. That night, her last night, Isabella had walked into the restaurant with her resignation already written. She'd planned to slip it to the manager and leave quietly. But fate had other plans. Kang Min-ho was there, at his usual table, with a woman draped across his lap. She was beautiful in that effortless Seoul way. Designer clothes, perfect skin, the kind of beauty that came from unlimited wealth and unlimited confidence. She was kissing his neck, her hand trailing down his chest, and he was letting her. His eyes were closed, his expression almost peaceful, and something inside Isabella cracked open. She'd had no right to feel betrayed, no claim on this man who'd never even touched her hand, but jealousy flooded through her anyway, hot and vicious and completely irrational. Before she could stop herself, before logic could intervene, Isabella was crossing the restaurant. The woman looked up as Isabella approached, her smile sharp and possessive. "Can we help you?" she asked in Korean, her tone making it clear Isabella was unwelcome. Isabella ignored her. Her eyes were locked on Kang Min-ho, who had opened his eyes and was watching her now with that same intense focus he always gave her. "Is this what you do?" Isabella asked, her voice shaking with emotion she couldn't name. "You stare at me for 2 weeks like I'm the only person in the world, Then act like I don't exist? The woman laughed, a cruel sound. You poor thing. Did you actually think you were special? Do you know how many women notice him? Kang Minho hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but something in his eyes had shifted, become predatory. Isabella should have walked away, should have remembered that this man was dangerous, that getting involved with him would complicate everything. Instead, she leaned down, her face inches from his, and said, "You're a coward." That's when he smiled. Really smiled, for the first time since she'd met him. Am I? His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something beneath it that made her skin prickle. Yes, you hide behind your power and your money and your reputation, but you're afraid to actually want something real. The woman beside him started to protest, but Kang Minho lifted one hand and she fell silent immediately. He shifted in his seat, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. You think you know me? I know men like you, Isabella said, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. You take what you want and discard it when you're bored. You hurt people because you can. You're empty inside. She expected him to get angry, to have her removed or worse. Instead, he stood slowly, his height forcing her to tilt her head back. He stepped closer, invading her space, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. Empty? He repeated, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. Is that what you think? It's what I know, Isabella said, even as her body betrayed her, her breathing quickening, her skin flushing. He reached out then, his fingers brushing her cheek so gently it felt like a whisper. The gesture sent electricity through her entire body, making her gasp. You know nothing about me, Isabella, he said, his thumb tracing her jawline. But you're about to learn. That's when the other woman moved, her hand grabbing Isabella's arm hard enough to leave marks. Get away from him, you foreign troublemaker. The slap was pure instinct. Isabella's hand connected with the woman's face before thought could intervene, the sound sharp through the restaurant. The woman stumbled back, her hand flying to her reddening cheek, shock and rage warring on her perfect features. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. Then the woman lunged forward, fury in her eyes. Kang Minho caught her wrist mid-motion, his grip stopping her completely. Enough, he said, and the woman froze. His voice carried absolute authority, the kind that made people obey without question. She struck me, the woman said, her voice tight with anger. She dared to raise her hand to me. Kang Minho released her wrist, his attention shifting to Isabella. Leave us, he said to the woman. What? You can't be serious. She just hit me. His eyes were still on Isabella, studying her face with that intensity that made her feel exposed. I said leave. The woman opened her mouth to argue, then apparently thought better of it. She grabbed her purse and walked out, her heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. The restaurant was utterly silent, every customer frozen, every server watching. Kang Minho stepped even closer to Isabella, close enough that she could feel his breath on her face. You have fire, he said softly. I wondered if you did. Under all that careful control, all that professionalism, I wanted to see what it would take to make you show it. Isabella's hands were shaking. I'm leaving, she said. Tonight, I'm going back to Nigeria and forgetting I ever came to Korea. Something flickered in his eyes then, something that looked almost like concern. No, he said simply. You're not. You don't control me, Isabella said, even as her body swayed toward him like he was gravity and she was helpless against the pull. Don't I? His hand came up again, this time cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. You've been on my mind since the moment you walked into this restaurant. You just haven't acknowledged what's between us yet. Before she could respond, before she could even process those words, he leaned down, and their lips met in a moment that changed everything between them. The kiss had been nothing like Isabella expected. She'd thought he'd be rough, demanding, taking what he wanted. Instead, he'd kissed her like she was something precious, something he'd been waiting his whole life to hold. His lips had moved against hers with a tenderness that made her knees weak, one hand cradling her face while the other had settled on her waist, pulling her against him. Isabella had meant to push him away, had meant to remember that this man was dangerous, that getting involved with him would ruin her life. But her body had other ideas. Her hands had fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and she'd kissed him back with all the frustration and desire and confusion she'd been feeling for 2 weeks. The kiss had deepened, become more urgent, his tongue sliding against hers in a way that made heat pool low in her belly. Someone in the restaurant had gasped. Someone else had whispered. Isabella hadn't cared. In that moment, Kang Min-ho was the only thing in the world. When he'd finally pulled back, both of them breathing hard, he'd rested his forehead against hers. "You're not leaving Seoul," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're not leaving me." Isabella had been about to argue when the sound of slow clapping had made them both turn. A man had been standing near the entrance, older, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Behind him stood 6 men in black suits, their hands resting on visible weapons. The temperature in the restaurant had dropped 10 degrees. Kang Min-ho had immediately shifted, positioning his body between Isabella and the newcomer. "Park," he'd said, and there had been steel in his voice. "You're not welcome here." The older man, Park, had laughed. "Since when did the Kang family refuse hospitality?" "I'm hurt, Min-ho, truly hurt." His eyes had shifted to Isabella, and she'd felt his gaze like oil on her skin. "And who is this lovely creature, not your usual type?" Kang Min-ho's hand had found Isabella's, his grip tight and possessive. "Leave. Now." "But I came all this way to give you a message," Park had said, his smile widening. "The council has made a decision. Your little empire is growing too large. You're becoming a problem that needs to be solved." The men behind him had moved forward, hands reaching for their weapons. Kang Min-ho had moved faster. One moment he'd been beside Isabella, the next he'd somehow crossed the distance and had Park by the throat, lifting him slightly off the ground. The older man's guards had frozen, clearly shocked by the speed and violence. "Touch her and you die," Kang Min-ho had said quietly. "Look at her and you die. Breathe the same air as her, and I will burn everything you love to the ground." Park had choked, his face reddening, his hands clawing at Kang Min-ho's grip. "You're making a mistake," he'd gasped. "She's a weakness." Kang Min-ho had leaned closer, his voice dropping to something that made Isabella's blood run cold. "She's mine, and I protect what's mine." He'd released Park then, letting him stumble backward into his guards. "Tell the council I'm done playing by their rules. If they want war, I'll give them war, but they'll lose." Park had rubbed his throat, his eyes filled with rage, and something that might have been respect. "You've signed both your death warrants," he'd said, looking between Kang Min-ho and Isabella. Then he gestured to his men and they'd left, melting into the night like shadows. The restaurant had remained silent for exactly 5 seconds. Then chaos had erupted. Customers had scrambled for the exits, servers had fled to the kitchen, and within moments the Silver Phoenix had emptied completely. Only Isabella and Kang Min-ho remained, standing in the center of the abandoned restaurant. Isabella's entire body had been shaking. "What just happened?" she'd asked. "What did you do?" Kang Min-ho had turned to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she'd seen fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for her. "I made a choice," he'd said. "I chose you over everything else. My position, my power, my safety." He'd crossed back to her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "That man was Park Do-jin, head of the Northern Syndicate. He came here to kill me, to send a message to the other families that the Kang Empire is vulnerable. I should have negotiated, should have played politics. Instead, I threatened him publicly, made it clear that I'm willing to start a war. Isabella had felt dizzy, because of me. You barely know me." "I know enough," Kang Min-ho had said, his thumbs stroking her collarbones through her uniform. "I know you're brave enough to slap someone who disrespected you. I know you're strong enough to come to a foreign country alone. I know you have fire in your soul that matches the fire in mine. I know that for 2 weeks I haven't been able to think about anything except what it would be like to make you mine." His forehead had touched hers again. "And I know that I'm not letting you go. Not now, not ever. You're insane," Isabella had whispered. "Completely insane. You can't start a war over someone you met 2 weeks ago." His smile had been sharp, dangerous. "Watch me." That's when the second slap had happened. Isabella had struck him across the face with all the strength she had, the sound echoing through the empty restaurant. His head had snapped to the side, and when he'd turned back to her, there had been a red mark blooming on his cheek. Everyone in Seoul would later hear about this moment. How Isabella Okafor, a foreign waitress with nothing to her name, had slapped Kang Min-ho twice in one night and lived to tell about it. "You don't get to decide my life," Isabella had said, her voice shaking with rage and fear, and something deeper she refused to name. "You don't get to drag me into your world and your wars and your violence. I didn't ask for any of this. Kang Min-ho had touched his reddening cheek, and to her shock, he'd laughed. Really laughed, a sound full of genuine amusement. "No, you didn't," he'd agreed. "But you're in it now whether you asked for it or not. Park saw you with me. He knows I care about you. That makes you a target." Isabella had felt the walls closing in. "Then I'll leave tonight. I'll go back to Nigeria, and none of this will matter." He'd caught her hand as she'd turned away, his grip gentle but unbreakable. "They'll follow you. Park doesn't leave loose ends. If you run, you'll die. But if you stay with me, under my protection, you might survive." The word might had hung between them like a noose. "So my choices are die trying to leave or die staying with you." His eyes had darkened with something that looked like pain. "Your choice is trust me to keep you safe, or trust that you can outrun the most powerful crime syndicate in Seoul." "I know which one I'd choose." Isabella had wanted to scream, to hit him again, to demand he turn back time and let her live her quiet, anonymous life. But she'd seen the truth in his eyes. Whatever she'd stumbled into tonight, whatever line she'd crossed by slapping that woman, by letting him kiss her, by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, there was no going back. "If I stay," she'd said slowly, "what does that mean? What are you asking from me?" Kang Min-ho had pulled her closer, his hand sliding to the small of her back. "Everything," he'd said honestly. "Your trust. Your time, your heart, eventually. I want you in my life, Isabella. Not as a possession, not as a trophy, but as my equal. My partner." "I don't even know you," she'd protested weakly. "Then let me show you who I am." He'd paused, then added the words that would change everything. "Marry me." Isabella's heart had stopped. "What?" "Marry me," he'd repeated, and this time there had been no hesitation in his voice. "Right now, tonight, make yourself untouchable by becoming my wife." She'd stepped back, or tried to, but his arm around her waist had held firm. "That's insane, we don't love each other. We barely know each other. Love can grow," Kang Min-ho had said. "But protection is immediate. As my wife, every family in Seoul will know you're off limits. Park won't dare touch you, no one will. You'll be safer than you've ever been in your life." Isabella had searched his face, looking for the lie, the manipulation. But all she'd seen was brutal honesty. "And what do you get out of this? Some foreign waitress who's terrified of you?" His hand had come up to cup her cheek, and the tenderness in the gesture had nearly broken her. "I get to keep you alive. That's all that matters to me." The next morning, Isabella had woken up in a penthouse apartment she didn't remember entering. Sunlight had streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, and for a moment she'd thought the previous night had been a fever dream. Then she'd looked down and seen the ring on her finger, a platinum band with a diamond so large it should have been obscene. It was real, all of it. She'd married Kang Min-ho in a ceremony she barely remembered, shock and fear making the whole night blur together. A judge had come to his apartment at 2 a.m. Papers had been signed, vows had been exchanged, and now she was Mrs. Kang Min-ho, wife of Seoul's most dangerous man. The door to the bedroom had opened and he'd appeared, already dressed in a charcoal suit, looking like he'd slept peacefully instead of getting married to a virtual stranger in the middle of the night. "You're awake," he'd said, carrying a tray with breakfast. "I wasn't sure if you'd prefer Western or Korean, so I had the kitchen prepare both." Isabella had sat up, pulling the silk sheets around her body, suddenly aware she was wearing nothing but one of his shirts. She didn't remember changing. Didn't remember anything after signing the marriage certificate. "Did we?" she'd started, unable to finish the question. Understanding had crossed his face. "No, you fell asleep in the car. I brought you here, helped you change, and slept on the couch." He'd set the tray on the bedside table. "I'm not that kind of man, Isabella. When we're together, you'll be fully present and fully willing." The casual certainty in his voice when we're together, not if, had made her pulse spike. "I can't believe I married you," she'd said, staring at the ring. "I can't believe you married me," he'd replied, and there had been something vulnerable in his expression. "A woman who slapped me twice and called me empty. But here we are." Here they were indeed. Over the following days, Isabella had discovered what it meant to be Kang Min-ho's wife. The penthouse was hers to do with as she pleased. A credit card appeared with no limit. Security followed her everywhere. Silent men in black suits who made other people move out of her way. Everywhere she went, people bowed, called her Mrs. Kang, treated her like royalty. It was suffocating and surreal, and nothing like the life she'd imagined for herself. But more than all of that was Kang Min-ho himself. He'd been patient with her, giving her space to adjust, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. But he was always there, always watching. She'd wake to find him in the kitchen making coffee. Come home to find him in his office working. Fall asleep on the couch only to wake up covered with a blanket he'd placed over her. He moved through her life like he belonged there, like he'd always been there. And slowly, terrifyingly, she'd started to rely on his presence. A week after their marriage, Isabella had been shopping with her assigned bodyguard when she'd seen him. Park Do-jin, the man from the restaurant, standing across the street watching her. Their eyes had met, and he'd smiled, slow and menacing, before disappearing into the crowd. She'd called Kang Min-ho immediately, her hands shaking. He'd arrived within minutes, his car screeching to a stop, his face pale with barely controlled rage. "Did he touch you?" he'd demanded. "Did he say anything?" She'd shaken her head. "He just watched me, then he left." Kang Min-ho had pulled her against him right there on the busy Seoul street, his arms wrapping around her like he could shield her from the world. "He's sending a message," he'd said into her hair. "He wants me to know he can get to you anytime he wants." Isabella had felt his heart racing against her cheek. "What are we going to do?" His arms had tightened. "We're going to win." That night, back in the penthouse, Kang Min-ho had finally explained everything. His world, his business, the delicate balance of power he maintained, the other families who wanted him gone, the politicians he paid off, the police who looked the other way, the violence that simmered just beneath Seoul's glossy surface. He'd told her about his childhood, raised by a father who'd beaten respect into him, about inheriting an empire at 22 when his father was killed, about building something larger, more powerful, more feared than anything Seoul had seen in generations. "I'm not a good man," he'd said, sitting across from her in his study. "I've done things that would make you hate me if you knew the details. I've hurt people, killed people, built my empire on blood and fear." Isabella had listened without interrupting. "But I've never lied to you," he'd continued. "And I won't start now. You married a monster, Isabella. A monster who's trying very hard to be human for you." She'd stood, crossed the space between them, and done something that had surprised them both. She'd kissed him. Not the desperate kiss from the restaurant, but something slower, deeper. A kiss that said, "I see you, I understand you, and I'm choosing to stay anyway." When she'd pulled back, his eyes had been wide with shock. "I'm not leaving," Isabella had said. "Not because I'm trapped, but because I'm choosing this. Choosing you, even knowing what you are." Something in his expression had cracked open. "Why?" he'd asked, his voice rough. "Because somewhere under the monster is a man who saved me," she'd said. "A man who hasn't touched me even though we're married. A man who makes sure I eat breakfast and covers me with blankets and looks at me like I'm the most important thing in his world. That man is worth fighting for." Kang Min-ho had stood, pulling her against him. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," she'd agreed. "But you're stuck with me now." He'd laughed against her hair. Then he'd scooped her up like she weighed nothing and carried her to his bedroom, to their bedroom. And for the first time since their wedding night, they'd shared that space not as strangers, but as something more, something fragile and new and terrifying. Their bodies had come together with a tenderness that had shocked her. His hands reverent on her skin, his lips mapping every curve like he was memorizing her. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of him and now her too, Isabella had felt something shift in her chest, something that might eventually become love. The next morning, Isabella had woken alone in the massive bed, panic clawing at her chest. The sheets beside her were cold, like he'd been gone for hours. All her fears had come flooding back. He'd gotten what he wanted, and now he was done with her. She'd been a novelty, nothing more. She'd wrapped herself in his shirt, and been halfway to the door when she'd heard voices in the living room. Male voices, angry and urgent. She'd crept closer, pressing herself against the wall. "You can't be serious about this," someone had been saying in Korean. "She's nobody. A foreign waitress you knew for 2 weeks. This marriage is a liability." Kang Min-ho's voice had cut through, cold as winter. "My marriage is none of your concern, Hyun-woo." The other man, Hyun-woo, had laughed bitterly. "None of my concern? I'm your second in command. Your decisions affect all of us. This woman has made you weak. Park is already circling, waiting for you to make a mistake." "I haven't made a mistake," Kang Min-ho had said, but there had been something in his tone that made Isabella's heart clench. "Haven't you? You threatened Park Do-jin, head of the Northern Syndicate, over some girl. You married her within hours. You're so obsessed with protecting her that you're neglecting everything else. The shipments from Busan are delayed. The negotiations with the Yakuza are falling apart. And why? Because you're playing house with a woman who doesn't belong in our world. Isabella had pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back the tears. Every word had been a knife. Every accusation had fed the voice in her head that said she was a burden, that Kang Min-ho would regret saving her. "Get out," Kang Min-ho had said quietly. "What?" I said, "Get out. You're dismissed from my service, effective immediately." The shock in Hyunwoo's voice had been palpable. "You can't mean that. I've been with you for 10 years. And in those 10 years, you've never questioned my decisions. Until now." Kang Min-ho's voice had grown softer, more dangerous. "My wife is not a topic for discussion. She's not a weakness. She's the only thing in my life that's real. If you can't respect that, you have no place in my organization." The sound of footsteps, then the door slamming. Isabella had stood frozen, processing what she'd just heard. Then Kang Min-ho had appeared in the hallway, still in his dress shirt from the night before, his hair disheveled. His eyes had found hers immediately. "How much did you hear?" he'd asked. "Enough," Isabella had whispered. "Enough to know that I'm destroying your life." He'd crossed to her in 3 strides, his hands framing her face. "You heard wrong. You're not destroying anything. You're the first thing I've ever wanted more than power." His thumbs had wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Hyunwoo was right about one thing, though. "I am obsessed with you. Completely, dangerously. I can't think about anything else." "Maybe you should," Isabella had said, even as her body had swayed toward him. Maybe this was a mistake. His grip had tightened fractionally. Don't you dare try to leave me now. Not after last night. Not after I've finally had you." The raw possessiveness in his voice had sent heat flooding through her. "I'm not leaving. But maybe I should stay somewhere else for a while. Let you focus on your business." No. The word had been absolute. "You stay here with me, in my bed, where you belong." He'd leaned down, his lips brushing hers. "I don't care if the whole world burns down around us. You're mine, Isabella, and I'm keeping you." She'd kissed him then, pouring all her fear and confusion and desperate hope into it. His response had been immediate and overwhelming, lifting her against him, her legs wrapping around his waist as he'd carried her back to the bedroom. And this time, when they'd come together, there had been a desperation to it, like they were both trying to prove something, that this was real, that they could survive whatever was coming. By the end of the week, things had started to unravel. First, there was the incident at the charity gala. Kang Min-ho had insisted Isabella accompany him to a fundraiser for a children's hospital, one of the legitimate fronts that kept his business respectable. She'd worn a dress he'd had made for her, emerald green silk that clung to her curves and made her dark skin glow. The moment they'd entered the ballroom, all eyes had turned to them. She'd heard the whispers, seen the judgment in the faces of Seoul's elite. Foreign, unsuitable. Gold digger, Kang Min-ho had kept his hand on the small of her back the entire evening, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. They'd been talking to a group of businessmen when a woman had approached, stunning in the way only old money could achieve. She'd looked at Isabella like something unpleasant on her shoe. "Min-ho," she'd said in English, clearly for Isabella's benefit. "I heard you'd gotten married." I didn't believe it until now. Her smile had been all teeth. How unexpected. "Ji-won," Kang Min-ho had replied, his voice carefully neutral. "This is my wife, Isabella." Ji-won had extended a hand, her grip when Isabella took it just slightly too tight. "Charming, tell me, how did you two meet? I'm sure it's a fascinating story." The malice beneath her pleasant tone had been obvious. Isabella had felt Kang Min-ho tense beside her. "We met at a restaurant," Isabella had said, keeping her voice steady. Sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them. Ji-won's smile had sharpened. "A restaurant, how romantic. And what did you do there? Were you dining?" The implication had been clear. Isabella had felt her face flush hot. "I was working. I'm not ashamed of honest work." Kang Min-ho had stepped forward, his voice dropping to something lethal. "Ji-won, I suggest you walk away now before you say something that makes me forget we grew up together." But Ji-won had apparently decided she had nothing to lose. "Everyone's talking about it, you know. How you married some foreign waitress you barely knew. How she must have trapped you somehow. How it's only a matter of time before you come to your senses and annul this ridiculous marriage." Isabella had felt the words like physical blows. Before Kang Min-ho could respond, before she could even think, Isabella had stepped forward. "You're right," she'd said clearly, loud enough that the conversations around them had stopped. "I did trap him. With my devastating wit, my incredible cooking skills, and my ability to see through the bullshit that people like you wrap yourselves in. The ballroom had gone silent. I may be foreign, I may have been a waitress, but at least I'm honest about who I am. Can you say the same? Isabella had turned to Kang Minho. I'd like to leave now. He'd looked at her with something like awe in his eyes. Then he'd taken her hand, and they'd walked out together, leaving Seoul's elite staring after them in shock. In the car, Kang Minho had pulled her onto his lap, kissing her so deeply she'd forgotten how to breathe. That was incredible, he'd said against her lips. You were incredible. I probably just made things worse for you, Isabella had said. But she'd been smiling. I don't care, did you see her face? He'd laughed, actually laughed, and the sound had been beautiful. I love you. The words had fallen into the space between them like stones into still water. Isabella had gone very still. What? Kang Minho's expression had shifted, becoming vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. I love you, I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other, but I've never felt like this about anyone. You make me want to be better. You make me feel human. Isabella had touched his face, her thumb tracing his cheekbone. I think I love you too, she'd whispered, which is absolutely insane because you're a criminal, and my life has become a Korean drama, and I should definitely know better. His smile had been brilliant, but you don't. But I don't, she'd agreed. And then they'd stopped talking entirely, lost in each other as the car had driven through Seoul's glittering streets. The attack had come 3 days later. Isabella had been shopping, surrounded by security as always, when the black vans had appeared. Men with guns had poured out before anyone could react. Her bodyguards had tried to protect her, but they'd been outnumbered. She'd seen 2 of them go down, blood spreading across the sidewalk, before rough hands had grabbed her. A bag had gone over her head. She'd been thrown into a van, and then darkness. She'd woken in a warehouse tied to a chair, her head pounding. The bag had been removed, and she'd found herself facing Park Do-jin. He'd smiled at her, that same cold smile from the restaurant. Mrs. Kang, he'd said pleasantly. So nice of you to join us. Isabella's mouth had been dry with fear, but she'd forced her voice steady. You're making a mistake. My husband will kill you for this. Will he? Park had circled her like a shark. That's what I'm counting on. You see, your husband has become careless. Emotional. He cares more about you than his empire. That makes him weak. And weak leaders don't survive in our world. He'd stopped in front of her, tilting her chin up with one finger. You're going to help me destroy him. Isabella had jerked away from his touch. I'll never help you. Park's smile had widened. You already are, just by existing, just by being his weakness. He'd pulled out a phone, pressed a button, and Kang Minho's voice had filled the warehouse. Where is she? What have you done with my wife? The desperation in his voice had made Isabella's heart clench. Park had held the phone closer to Isabella. Say hello to your husband, Mrs. Kang. Isabella had met Park's eyes. Don't come for me, she'd said clearly. It's a trap. He wants you to act emotionally. Don't give him what he wants. There had been silence on the other end of the line. Then Kang Minho had spoken, and his voice had been something Isabella had never heard before. Pure distilled fury, Park Do-jin. I'm going to give you one chance. Let her go now, unharmed, and I'll kill you quickly. But if you hurt her, if you so much as bruise her skin, I will make you beg for death for days before I grant it. Park had laughed. Big words. But you're not in a position to make threats. I have something you want. The question is, what are you willing to trade for it? There had been a pause. Everything, Kang Minho had said simply. My territory, my operations, my money, all of it. Just let her go. Isabella's eyes had widened. No, she'd said urgently. Don't you dare. Don't give up everything for me. But Kang Minho hadn't been listening. Tell me where she is. I'll come alone. We'll make the exchange. Park had smiled with satisfaction. Now that's more like it. I'll send you the address. You have 2 hours. Come alone or she dies. He'd ended the call. Isabella had struggled against her restraints. You can't let him do this. It's exactly what Park wants. He'll take everything and kill us both. Your husband is smarter than you think, Park had said. But love makes even smart men stupid. He'll come. And when he does, I'll have everything I've ever wanted. The 2 hours had felt like 2 years. Isabella had been moved to a different location, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of Seoul. More men had arrived. Heavy weapons had been positioned. It was clear Park wasn't taking any chances. Whatever he had planned, he expected it to be bloody. When Kang Minho had finally arrived, he'd been alone as promised. No security, no weapons that Isabella could see. Just him, walking into the factory like he was walking into his own home. He'd looked at her first, his eyes cataloging every detail, making sure she was unharmed. Then his gaze had shifted to Park. "Let her go, I'm here. Make the trade." Park had gestured and 2 men had cut Isabella's bonds. She'd stood on shaky legs, but when she'd tried to go to Kang Min-ho, Park had grabbed her arm. "Not so fast. First, the transfer of assets. I want the access codes to all your accounts, deeds to all your properties, lists of all your operations." Kang Min-ho had pulled out a folder from inside his jacket. "It's all here, everything you asked for." He'd held it out. Park had taken it, flipping through the pages with a satisfied smile. "You really are a fool, Kang Min-ho. Trading an empire for a woman." He'd looked at Isabella. She must be incredible in bed. Isabella had felt Kang Min-ho tense even from across the warehouse. "Let her go now." Park had released Isabella's arm, pushing her forward. She'd stumbled toward Kang Min-ho, and his arms had come around her immediately, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I've got you," he'd whispered. "You're safe, I've got you." That's when Park had pulled out a gun. "Did you really think I'd let you both walk away?" But Kang Min-ho had smiled, actually smiled. "Did you really think I'd give you my empire without a backup plan?" The lights in the factory had suddenly gone out. In the darkness, gunfire had erupted. Isabella had felt Kang Min-ho pull her down, his body covering hers, protecting her from the chaos. She'd heard shouting in Korean, screams, the sound of running feet. Then, as suddenly as it had started, silence. The lights had come back on. Park's men were on the ground, unconscious or worse. Kang Min-ho's people had emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, armed and efficient. And standing over Park Do-jin, who was on his knees with a gun to his head, was Hyun-woo. "You were right," Kang Min-ho had said to Park conversationally. "Love does make men do stupid things. But you made a mistake. You assumed I'd come alone. You assumed I'd sacrifice everything for her." He'd stood pulling Isabella up with him. "What I actually did was use you. Use your predictability, use your arrogance. While you were focused on me, my people were taking over every single one of your operations. The folder I gave you, fake, completely worthless, but your men believed it was real. So when I showed up, they thought you'd won." Park's face had gone white with rage. "You bastard." "I am," Kang Min-ho had agreed. "But I'm a bastard who's still standing. And you're not." He'd looked at Hyun-woo. "Finish it." But before Hyun-woo could pull the trigger, Isabella had stepped forward. "Wait." Everyone had turned to look at her. "Let him live," she'd said. Kang Min-ho's expression had been shocked. "Isabella, he kidnapped you. He was going to kill us both." "I know, but if you kill him, you're no better than he is. You told me you wanted to be human for me. Humans show mercy." She'd met Park's eyes. "Exile him, strip him of everything. But let him live with the knowledge that he lost." Kang Min-ho had been silent for a long moment. Then he'd nodded to Hyun-woo. "You heard my wife exile. Make sure everyone knows what happens when you threaten the Kang family." That night, back in their penthouse, Isabella had finally broken down. All the fear, all the adrenaline, all the terror she'd been holding back had come flooding out in racking sobs. Kang Min-ho had held her through it, his hands gentle on her back, his voice murmuring comfort in Korean and English. "I'm sorry," he'd said over and over. "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you better." "You did protect me," Isabella had said when she could finally speak. "You came for me. You were willing to give up everything." His hand had cupped her face. "I would have, without hesitation, without regret. You're worth more than any empire." She'd kissed him then, desperate and needy, wanting to feel alive after coming so close to death. They'd come together with an urgency that spoke of how close they'd come to losing each other, and afterward, tangled in sheets that smelled of both of them, Isabella had finally said the words without reservation. "I love you completely, terrifyingly, forever." Kang Min-ho had looked at her like she'd given him the world. "Marry me again," he'd said. "What?" "Marry me again, properly this time. Not in the middle of the night because we're both terrified, but because we choose each other. Because we love each other. Because I want the whole world to know you're mine." Isabella had smiled through fresh tears. "We're already married. Then marry me again anyway." He'd kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Let me give you the wedding you deserved. Let me show you off. Let me make promises to you when we're both certain of what they mean." How could she say no to that? 3 months later, They'd been married again in a ceremony that had been simultaneously traditional and completely unconventional. Isabella had worn both a white Western gown and a traditional Korean hanbok, switching between them throughout the day. Her mother had flown in from Lagos, crying through the entire ceremony. Kang Min-ho's family, what was left of them, had attended with expressions ranging from resigned to actually pleased. But the most important moment had come when they'd been alone, after all the guests had left, standing on the balcony of their penthouse watching Seoul spread out beneath them. "I never thought I'd have this," Kang Min-ho had said quietly. "A wife, a family, something real." Isabella had laced her fingers through his. "You have it now, and I'm not going anywhere." 6 months after that, Isabella had taken a pregnancy test with shaking hands. When it had shown positive, she'd been terrified and thrilled in equal measure. She'd told Kang Min-ho over dinner, just blurting it out because she'd never been good at subtlety. He'd gone very still. Then he'd stood, crossed to her, dropped to his knees, and pressed his face against her stomach. She'd felt him trembling. When he'd looked up, there had been tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he'd said hoarsely. "Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I needed." Their daughter had been born on a spring morning. All dark curls and golden skin and a cry that had seemed far too loud for something so small. Kang Min-ho had held her with a reverence that had made Isabella's heart ache, this dangerous man reduced to trembling awe by 7 pounds of infant. "She's perfect," he'd whispered. "You're both perfect." And as Isabella had watched her husband, the man who'd threatened to kill for her, who'd given up an empire for her, who'd chosen love over power again and again, hold their daughter like she was made of spun glass, she'd known that everything had been worth it. Every moment of fear, every moment of doubt, every terrifying second of their journey together had led to this, to their family, to their future. To love that had conquered everything thrown against it. Years later, when people asked Isabella about her love story, about how she'd ended up married to one of Seoul's most powerful men, she always smiled and said the same thing. "I slapped him twice, and somehow that was exactly what we both needed."